Warm welcome to you to this Festival of Ideas panel in collaboration with the history faculty. As I said, I'm Shruti Kapila. I'm a historian of modern India, global political thought, and world history, which was erstwhile called imperial history. So today, I think we've got two stellar people on this panel. Victor Malet, who has been with the Financial Times for the better part of his excellent career, exhilarating career, working in Europe, Africa, but of late headed the bureau in Delhi and is currently the Asian news editor based out of Hong Kong. So we are incredibly lucky to have him amongst us. He's also just got a book out of his experience in India called The River of Life, The River of Death, The Ganges and India's Future. So from a slight change in the program, what we thought would be we'd actually start with Asia now. We were going to start with Europe, Empire and museums with Tristram and end with where the future is, which is Asia, I would say. But I think we're now going to start with Victor to make time, to keep to time. And so without further ado, welcome Victor.
Thank you very much, Shruti, and I'm sorry that your star appearers are not here yet. There was a problem on the train coming from London, and also sorry that my colleague and friend Gideon Rachman is also not here. He's in Shanghai, unfortunately, this week. So some of you may have seen him advertised on the program, and I'm taking his place at rather short notice. So I don't have a kind of speech prepared, and I think Tristram is going to talk very much about the cultural context of the subject at hand, Brexit and empire. I'll try and just say a few words based on my experience in India and Asia on the political and economic context in which all this happens, and then of course you're more than welcome, I think, to ask questions either at the end or in the middle if Tristram still doesn't manage.
He's at the station.
He's at the station. Okay, so that's good. In looking at the way sort of Brexit has been perceived, I mean, my view is that there's quite a lot of naivete and quite a lot of misunderstandings on all sides. Now, I think it's fairly evident that this is certainly the case in Britain. The kind of views that the old empire, that the Commonwealth countries are going to replace the EU as our great trading partners is in my view, quite misguided. I mean, Boris Johnson was talking about doing trade deals, at least with the fastest growing Commonwealth economies, and building a truly global Britain. But I think there's also actually, I found some quite interesting sort of naivetes on the other side, if you like. Well, certainly on the British-Indian side of things. I met, when Narendra Modi came and spoke at Wembley Stadium with David Cameron, it was unfortunately overshadowed very quickly by the bombings in Paris. But I met a lot of Indians there who were sort of quite Brexity, you know, and they, I think they had the view that that somehow by leaving, by Britain going it alone, this would be good for relations between the subcontinent, between India and Britain, and you know, it didn't really matter that we were going to exclude Poles and Bulgarians and everyone else. And I think that was a naive view, because I think the way it's turned out, and certainly the way that UKIP and so on waged the campaign, there were elements of racism that were certainly at least as anti-Indian or anti-Bangladeshi as they were anti-Polish or anti-Romanian. So that's the kind of the perception that I have. Now, why do I think people are naive about the possibilities of doing these great trade deals with the rest of the world? I mean, I don't know if you remember, but years ago, Edith Cresson, who I think went on to become Prime Minister of France, but I think at the time she was a minister in the government, she talked about Britain as bringing an aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe, by which she meant that Japanese car makers were setting up in Britain precisely so they could take over the European market, which of course is exactly what they've done. And Britain is a great car manufacturing centre for Europe. And obviously all this kind of thing, as we now know, is at risk from Brexit. So the nostalgia, I think, for oh, and I should mention, I mean, Tata, of course, which is a big Indian group, I think is it was, I'm not sure if it still is, the biggest private sector employer in Britain, not only because it makes cars, Jaguar Land Rover, but it also has a tea company, that owns Tetley's, and it does a lot of IT services as well. So, you know, a company like Tata, one of the reasons it likes to be in Britain is not just for the British market, but so that it can export Jaguar Land Rover cars across Europe. And in fact, if you go down the M20, you will see car transporter after car transporter taking those cars from this part of the world or from central England to the continent. But the real problem, I think, is that the nostalgia for empire, which we do see, you know, we had Boris, didn't we, the other day, quoting Kipling in Myanmar, is not shared, really, I think, by... this may sound obvious. And I think, you know, but I think there's a genuine lack of understanding among many people in Britain, and I haven't lived in Britain for 20 years or more, so every time I come back to Britain, I'm kind of astonished by how things have changed. You know, if you go to Calcutta, a lot of people really hate Churchill, and they don't hate Churchill because he was a colonialist, or because he called Gandhi a half-naked fakir who was fighting for campaigning for Indian independence. They hate him because of the Bengal famine in 1943, for which they hold Churchill responsible. And of course, I mean, you know, the Calcutta airport, the main airport in Calcutta, is named after Subhash Chandra Bose, who was fighting on the side of the Japanese against the British. So there isn't as much nostalgia as a lot of Brits would like to think among the Commonwealth countries, and that applies even to Australia, New Zealand and Canada, the sort of Anglosphere, so to speak. These countries, their trading relationships are very much with China, very much with Southeast Asia, and of course the US, and only to a very small extent with Britain. And I think that's something that we have to bear in mind. I mean, China is obviously a very, very important part of the world trading system, and there is absolutely no love lost in China or Beijing for, you know, the British Empire. As you know, there's a lot of bad history there. Now, that doesn't mean, you know, that there's no chance of cooperating once we've left the EU, if we do leave the EU, with countries that are outside the European trading system. You know, there are lots of things we can do. We can, I mean, I've just written a book about the Ganges, and one of the things I say in that is, you know, there are some depressing things about the Ganges. It's being heavily polluted and so on. But you know, people in India are eager to learn from our experiences in Britain, and with the Thames, which was cleaned up. I don't know if you remember, but when I was a kid, they said if you fell in the Thames, you would have to have your stomach pumped because it was so toxic and it was devoid of all fish life and so on. That's now being restored. The Rhine in continental Europe has been restored. And you know, India is very keen to learn those lessons, same as the Chicago River. They want to know how to clean up rivers, and you know, we can help them do that. But that isn't, you know, that's just one little thing, if you like. It's not the fundamentally huge trading relationship that we're going to need if we're going to in any way replace Europe. So you know, and there is a myth, I think, also that that the British Empire was built on free trade. Now, this is, you know, I mean, I think it's sort of fairly well established now. There may be some controversy about it, but this is basically nonsense. It was built on domination and on extreme protectionism. In fact, Shashi Tharoor, who wrote the book called Inglorious Empire, which he was here, was he? It was a polemical book, but and it's quite funny coming from Shashi Tharoor, who's like the ultimate Indian Englishman. You know, he loves P.G. Woodhouse. He likes to play cricket. He likes to watch cricket. He drinks tea. He has a sort of wonderfully drawling British accent, you know. And yet he wrote this wonderful polemic which arose out of a debate at the Oxford Union. about how essentially British colonialism was not a good thing, it was a disaster for India. And he made the point that the Industrial Revolution in Britain, I think his words were, was built on the destruction of India's thriving manufacturing industries. And that is, I think, provably true, even if one can disagree with some of the comments, some of the comments he makes in his book, which is, as I said, it is a polemic, although it's a very well-written polemic. And just to sort of put Britain's role in some sort of historical context, I was just looking in my book for sort of passages about this, and just really one paragraph. Don't worry, I won't bang on too much about the Ganges, but and about Ralph Fitch and his experiences. This was an English merchant at the time of Shakespeare. So nearly 2 millennia after Megasthenes, the Greek, had wondered at the glories of Pataliputra, which is now Patna, the first envoys, traders and travellers began to arrive in India from northwest Europe. Ralph Fitch, an English merchant, led an embassy to the Emperor Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, that's Akbar the Great, in 1585 from Queen Elizabeth I. Her letter from Elizabeth, by the grace of God, defender of the faith, to the most invincible and mighty Prince Zalabdin Etshabar, King of Kambaya, she didn't quite get the details right, but requested mutual and friendly traffic of merchandise on both sides. That is to say, between England and India. Akbar, however, was too busy. The Emperor Akbar was too busy to meet Fitch. As the historian Michael Wood points out, Akbar governed over 100 million people and was establishing India at the time as a world power, whereas Elizabeth ruled just 3 million subjects, which Wood called the equivalent of a small principality in the Deccan, on the outermost fringes of the inhabited world. So that was the position back in the 16th century, and it's not quite that bad now, but it is wrong to think that Britain is going to be at the centre of anybody's thoughts when it comes to world trade. And the reason, people like to negotiate and negotiate in a more agreeable way for all the participants with powerful trading blocs, and the EU, of course, is exactly that. Just to go back to some statistics, in 1600, when the East India Company was founded, Britain accounted for 1.8% of global GDP and India for 23%. So, and India and China together were sort of 3/4 of world manufacturing output in about 1750. So we may not be going back to that point, but we are definitely getting a massive Asianization of the world economy. Now, for example, there's been, Cameron and Theresa May, Cameron made, I think, 3 trips to India to try and boost this kind of trading relationship, and he was notably unsuccessful. Theresa May also, I think one of her first trips, or possibly her first foreign trip, was to India. And again, dealing with India is often difficult, but I don't think she succeeded in getting these great sort of benefits that she was looking for. And it's worth pointing out, as I read in an article today, that the UK exports 10 times as much to Germany as it does to India. So we have to bear all that in mind. I think I'll probably leave it there. Just a thought about identity politics, which is, I think, affecting all our worlds right now in a slightly scary way. Nationalism, identity politics. We see it not just here in Britain, where I'm astounded by this sort of divisiveness. My little village in Kent, people sort of hate each other for voting Brexit or for not voting for Brexit. This is just extraordinary, and it's rather like the US, where Trump and anti-Trump people are at each other's throats. Catalonia, we've got huge problems there. We've got quite a lot of extreme nationalism now in China, with Xi Jinping taking almost dictatorial power. We've even got the signs of more kind of deeper identity politics in India today, and even in Myanmar, where we've seen half the Rohingya Muslim population fleeing across the border to Bangladesh because of what is essentially a Buddhist hegemonic chauvinism, supported apparently by Aung San Suu Kyi. So we have, in this very, very difficult, unstable world, I'm not sure it's realistic to expect that Britain can tie the knot successfully with, in trade terms at least, with China, with Australia, with India, with the old empire, in a way that can in any way replace the vitally important trading relationship that we have with the European Union. I mean, Christopher Booker in the Sunday Telegraph is notably anti-Europe in every way and anti-EU. He wrote an extraordinary column this last Sunday, which basically said that if we didn't have frictionless trade with Europe after Brexit, that would be an unthinkable catastrophe, I think were his words. So here you have somebody who's deeply pro-Brexit, who realises the vital importance of the trading relationship that we have with Europe. And of course, we do currently have frictionless trade with Europe because we're in Europe. But that's, you may have guessed that I'm a Remainer, but so I apologise to anyone who disagrees, but I'd be really interested to hear what anyone else thinks, whether anyone else thinks there is a chance of Britain, as it were, going it alone in trade terms. I mean, clearly it's not, we're not going to stop trading with Europe, but it seems to me that we need to trade advantageously with Europe and with everyone else, and we need to do it through opening our doors. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Victor. So could I just sort of ask a few questions before I open it out, since you've been everywhere, that is kind of rising. I want to say that I think in my impression, not just impression, but living in India, one has felt that empire has actually been forgotten. Though they are like remnants of long legacies in terms of buildings, the English language, tea, cricket. But as a polity, as an experience, people don't really refer to it. There is no nostalgia, there is no... So I was wondering how you want to kind of square that with its incessant revival in Britain. So you've had, all sorts of series, in the Indian summer, for instance, which was actually shot in Penang, because Shimla is now so polluted. But, you've had series, but you've also had, you have, of course, politicians like Boris Johnson, but it has not quite left Britain. In a way that, and in a way that the whole idea with Brexit was that somehow empire or a kind of global identity which was post-imperial could be fashioned. But the fundamental problem to me seems to me is not just trade, which you clearly bring out as not, no Indian government is now going to just roll the carpet out for any government, let alone a British one. But it's this problem. How do you sort of paint this kind of unevenness between this complete forgetfulness and this inability, and as a Britain and as a global Britain, how do you understand this?
No, I completely agree. I mean, unfortunately, I can't really speak for what's happening in Britain because I've spent like 3 days here in the last year, I think, and I really don't know what's going on here, but I do know a little bit about what's going on in Asia, and you're absolutely right. There is. Actually, I mean, in a way, this book was an anomaly, this book by Shashi Tharoor, going back to the issue of empire, because you're absolutely right, and it arose because he did this debate in Oxford, and he is obviously a very sort of internationalised Indian, he was nearly Secretary General of the UN. But you're absolutely right, most Indians and most Australians and most Chinese don't really think about it very much. I mean, they certainly, I personally think that the Commonwealth is an institution that has had its day and probably has no real purpose anymore. It's very easy to set up institutions and very difficult to kind of say goodbye to them, but there comes a time when institutions sort of run out of useful road, and I think probably the Commonwealth has come to that. People just have other concerns. It's absolutely true. I don't know why this is an issue in Britain, but it's certainly not an issue elsewhere. People are much more concerned about here's the man you've all been waiting for. People are much more concerned about contemporary issues. I mean, if there's a sort of issue from the past that people are very interested in the history of, it's partition, because obviously partition continues to have profound effects on what happens today in partition between Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. So. That's my take. I mean, just to say that you're right, and welcome. He's the cultural one.
Yes, no, he has other things to say. But so finally, before we move on, what would you say has driven to kind of a paradoxical effect? Like you have economic nationalism everywhere. So it's not that India is fully globalized or looking out to it. It's highly protectionist. In a way, Modi has lost a lot of support amongst the business world. So the Made in India stuff, Make in India stuff, or Swachh Bharat, all the big schemes are ultimately internal looking. Well, I'm just saying that how would we square the rise of economic nationalism, which is also what has happened to Britain? Or would you say Britain is much more about identity and political nationalism?
Yeah, that's interesting. There is a sort of element of economic nationalism in India, as there is in China, actually.
Yes.
I mean, one of the problems that big multinationals have is that they are constantly playing on an unfair playing field, an uneven playing field. Whether you're Facebook or Google, which can't operate in China freely, or whether you're a multinational making something in India, it is actually very difficult. However, having said that, it's also true that the Indian economy, which was insulated in previous global crises, financial crises, because it had actually a very low level of trade as a proportion of GDP with the rest of the world, is now massively increased that, and it is now actually a significant trading nation, and it is therefore both exposed in a good way to the global trading regime, because it has actually opened up, despite everything, despite all the talk. India is actually quite an open economy, and trade is now a very important part of the economy, which means that India both benefits from global trade and would suffer in a global financial crisis in a way that wasn't true before. China has always, in recent times, has been that way already. I just want to say one thing about, to sort of underline my point about how countries are not sort of looking to Britain with great nostalgia. Every time I come to London, having been on the metro in Korea or in Hong Kong or in China, you sit on the tube and you suddenly realise your phone doesn't work. There's no connection underground. I mean, this is kind of shocking to my daughters anyway. Not so shocking to me, because I remember when there were no smartphones. But Britain and these train problems. Well, they may happen in India, but I can assure you they happen very rarely in Hong Kong. So the idea that everybody is sort of looking to come here for the white hot British economy. What was it? Was it leaves on the line, or was it
trespasser at the next one?
The other day I was coming up to London from Kent, and it was wonderful because the train stopped and. The driver came on the line and he said, "There's a cow on the line." And I thought, that's I feel at home. I'm back in India, although sometimes it's elephants on the line. Anyway, I better leave the floor to this.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you.